I'd always wanted to go fishing in the winter. Something about the cold and snow along the riverbank seemed so peaceful to me. Only problem was I couldn't get anyone to come with me. I may be a strong woman, but hiking into the woods alone didn't seem like the brightest idea. But after about a month of trying to convince literally anyone to come with me, I realized going alone was my only option. I kept track of the weather and had a date set in early January. It's our coldest month of the year, but there was about a week where we were supposed to get nothing but sun. Out of the ordinary weather, but I was grateful, and I told my family exactly where I was going and where I'd be parking my car. My mom slipped an AirTag into the bag on my way out the door, and I was off. I parked my car along the side of the main road and followed the trail to the fishing spot a buddy of mine from work told me about. Something felt off, though. My hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I got goosebumps all over my body. I kept getting the feeling someone was watching me, even following me. I had underestimated how deep the snow could be. I thought that since the day before was sunny, most of it may have actually been melted by then. But no, it may have been sunny, but it was still extremely cold, so the snow turned to ice. My feet would break through the top layer of ice and fall into the still powdery snow beneath. I hadn't worn the tallest boots, so a lot was able to make its way into my socks and even begin to soak my feet. I was considering turning around and going back to my car. It seemed like there were red flags going off everywhere. But my mom always tells me to not be so paranoid, so I continued onward. The feeling of someone following me never went away, though. Every now and again throughout the hike, I'd hear a branch snap or snow crunch around me. When I looked around and saw nothing, I tried to just chalk it up to a deer running by or something. The explanations I came up with were to just try to make myself feel better about not turning back when I wasn't so deep into the woods. My feet were almost numb and my legs were sore when I finally reached the riverbank. I pulled out my gear and changed my socks, thanking my mom in my head for packing me an extra pair. I put on my waders and made my way into the water, grateful that I wasn't getting any more wet than I already was. I stood there for what felt like hours before finally catching a fish. I wasn't planning on keeping any, so I just let it go. It was starting to get dark before I knew it, so I decided to pack up and head back. As I was packing my gear, I heard a grunting sound from across the river. I stood up quickly and took my gun from the holster and looked for the source of the sound. And that's when I saw him. A man, completely naked, standing on a fallen tree across the river staring at me. I didn't know what to think. I was in complete shock, and I even thought about pinching myself because it felt like some weird dream. I noticed his fingers and toes seemed to be completely black, claimed by what looked to be frostbite. I wondered how he was surviving the cold wearing absolutely nothing, but I guess he wasn't. He stood there, and I swear to God, he was growling, not making any movements. I kneeled down and put the last of my things in my bag and looked back to see what the man was doing. But by that point, he was gone. I started to panic. Was he making his way over to me? I slung my backpack onto my back and kept a firm hold on my gun as I re-entered the woods, back on the trail towards my car. I didn't know what to think. The whole time I was rushing to get out of the forest, I just kept thinking the man was hiding behind every tree that I'd passed by. The hike takes about an hour walking, so I was almost completely sure that I'd be seeing him again. After walking around 20 minutes, I heard the same sounds as before, the branches snapping and the snow crunching. I knew he was out there watching me. I felt like I was about to cry. The fear that I was feeling in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever felt in my life. The sounds of someone following me getting closer and closer. My heart was racing, my breath quickened. I was looking around in every direction until I stopped, terrified. There he was, standing only 10 feet in front of me on the trail. He looked out of breath. There was steam coming off of his nude body as I now stared at him. I raised the gun and told him to leave me alone, but instead of listening, he began to take a step forward. I took a step back and screamed at the man to leave or I would shoot him. The expression on his face never changed. It was like he didn't even know what I was saying. He took another step forward, this time smirking as he did so. I took another step back and gave him one last warning that if he came any closer, I would shoot him. That didn't stop him. Instead, he lunged at me, and I shot. I chose to shoot at his legs. I didn't want to kill the man, just to make it so I could get away and call for help. He stumbled to the ground. He began screaming in pain. I ran by him and screamed as he reached for my legs. I kicked him in the face and he fell unconscious. The tears began to roll down my face as I ran the last bit of the trail back to the main road where my car was parked. I unlocked it and threw all my stuff inside. I put the key in the ignition and was horrified when I realized that it wasn't going to start. The sun was setting. I took out my phone and I began to call 911. They told me it would be at least 30 minutes before an officer could be out there, and that I should lock the doors and stay in the car no matter what. That was already my plan, though. After 10 minutes of waiting and getting more and more paranoid, there he was. The naked man, leaning against a tree on the edge of the forest just in front of my car. I screamed and pointed my gun at him yet again, this time aiming to kill. I didn't want to do it, but I absolutely would. He stumbled his way close to my car and leaned against the hood for support. He began banging his fist against the hood of my car as I screamed. Then he came around the side and screamed loudly at me through the window. Just screamed, and no actual words came out. I was sobbing at this point, begging for him to stop, but he wouldn't. Finally, I saw flashing red and blue lights in the distance, and the naked man obviously saw them too because he limped his way back into the woods and disappeared. The officer parked beside me and asked me what happened, and I spilled my guts, telling them everything. They called for a search team to look for the man, and they followed his trail of blood, but they were never able to find him. I had nightmares for months of the naked man following me wherever I went. Thankfully, they were just nightmares, and I never did see him again. I am sure of one thing, though. I will never go into those woods alone again. I was hitchhiking in the winter, trying to make my way back home after visiting my aunt who lived several hours away. I was in a rush, and my car had broken down unexpectedly, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. Now, for further context, I'm a chubby mid-20s guy, but still was scared to get in the car with a stranger. Like anyone else would be, but it was midwinter and I was grateful that it wasn't snowing. I got out of my car and stood on the edge of the road waiting for someone to come by and hopefully take me home, or as close as I could get. And that's when I saw the headlights of a large truck approaching in the distance. My heart sank. I wasn't sure I was ready to trust a stranger on the road, especially at this time of night. But as the truck got closer, I realized that I didn't have much choice. I threw my thumb out and hoped for the best. The truck actually pulled over, and the driver, a man who looked to be in his mid-50s with a grizzled beard and cold, dead eyes, rolled down the window.
"Where are you headed?"
he asked me with a raspy voice. I told him I was just going a few towns over.
"Hop in,"
he said, pointing to the passenger seat. I hesitated for a moment but then climbed in, grateful for the warmth. The gratitude didn't last long when I realized the truck was old and smelled musty with a layer of grime coating every surface. The driver pulled out a pack of cigarettes and smoked with the windows rolled completely up. I wasn't a smoker, so I was pretty disgusted. The driver was silent as he drove, and it really began to set in that I was alone in the cab with a stranger who could do anything he wanted to me. The snow was coming down even harder now, and I started to worry about the road conditions. The truck was shaking and rattling, and I could feel my heart racing. I tried to distract myself by asking the driver about his truck, but he didn't seem interested in talking. In fact, he just ignored me completely. After a few minutes of awkward silence, the driver pulled off the main road, and the truck suddenly lurched to a stop. I looked out the window and saw that we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of fields and rolling hills. "What's going on?" I asked him as I tried to keep the nervousness I was feeling out of my voice. The driver turned to me, his dark eyes shining in the dim light of the cab.
Don't worry,
He said with a sly smile.
I just need to make a quick stop. Be right back.
And with that, he got out of the truck and disappeared into the darkness. I was left alone, surrounded by dark, with every small sound scaring me to my core. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't a good idea. I wanted to get out and run, but I didn't know how far we were from the nearest town, and I didn't want to be lost out in the middle of nowhere during winter. I didn't even know if any other person would come along that time of night anyway. But after what felt like an eternity, the driver returned, carrying a large, wrapped-up package. He climbed back into the truck, threw it in the back seat, and started the engine, not bothering to explain what he'd been doing. It wasn't technically any of my business, and I certainly wasn't in any sort of position to ask, but I was curious. The rest of the drive was just as silent and uncomfortable as before. I tried to keep my eyes on the road ahead, but I couldn't help but steal a few glances at the driver. His eyes were fixed on the road, his hands tight on the wheel, and his face lacked any kind of expression at all. As the truck continued down the road, it began to snow very hard. It made it harder and harder to even see the road ahead of us. The truck started to skid and slide, and I could feel my heart racing with fear. I closed my eyes and prayed that we would make it to safety. Suddenly, the truck came to a stop, and I opened my eyes. We were in a small clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. I was about to ask what we were doing, but was cut off by the driver, ordering me out of the truck.
Get out,
he said, his voice harsh and gruff. I hesitated for a moment, but then I realized that I didn't have a choice. I opened the door and stepped out into the snow, feeling the chill seep into my bones. The driver got out as well, and I was really confused. "What are we doing here?" I tried asking, trying to keep my voice as steady as possible.
I need your help,
he said. I looked down at the package that he was holding, and my heart sank. It was wrapped in plastic and seemed to be covered in some type of substance that I could only presume to be blood. I didn't understand what was going on, but I didn't like where that was headed. He was holding a shovel in one hand and a knife in the other. My brain was telling me to run, to get out of there. But when I finally tried, I realized my feet were stuck in the deep snow. The driver caught up to me quickly, and before I knew it, he had me by the neck. I struggled and fought, but I couldn't break from his grip.
Please,
I begged.
Let me go. I won't tell anyone about any of this. I promise.
The driver didn't say a word. He just tightened his grip, and I could feel my consciousness beginning to slip away. Just as I thought I was about to black out, I heard a loud noise in the distance. It was the sound of a car engine, and it was getting closer. The noise must have spooked the driver because, for a split second, I was able to break free. I ran as fast as I could through the heavy snow, not stopping until I reached the road. A car pulled over, and the man in the driver's seat asked if everything was okay. I yelled "help me" at him as soon as I reached the car. He saw the truck driver chasing after me and told me to get in. I opened the door, jumped in the car, and slammed it behind me. The man who saved me sped off and took me directly towards the police station like I'd asked him to. I got his contact info and went inside. I told the police everything. Unfortunately, I'd not thought to memorize the truck driver's license plate, and they told me that they would do everything they could to look into it, but unfortunately, with how transient some of these truck drivers are, they say the ones that commit crimes tend to get away with it. The last time I checked in with that station, they told me that there was nothing else they could do unless I recognized the truck again and called in the plate number. Thankfully, I never saw the driver of the truck again, but I never forgot the look in his cold, dead eyes. I still have nightmares about that night, and I know that I'll never forget the fear and terror I felt as I was trapped in that snow-covered clearing but the man who I knew was about to end my life. I lived out here alone for the past 10 years, surrounded by fields and forests, with only the occasional neighbor for company. It's a peaceful life, and I love the quiet, but what happened that night 3 years ago shattered whatever peace was left. I was sitting in my living room, watching the snow fall outside through the large bay window in the front room, when my dog barked and ran out of the doggy door. I got up out of my chair as quickly as I could, but I was losing her. I chased after her, but she was fast and I lost her in the blizzard. I knew she had run over to my neighbor's property like she does often, so I went back to the house and put on my coat and boots and headed out to find her. The walk over was brutal. The wind was crazy and the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see my own hand in front of me. But I pressed on. I was determined to find my dog and bring her back home. This was not the kind of weather that was suitable for a dog, though. When I finally arrived at my neighbor's house, I was exhausted and covered in snow. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I thought maybe he was out, so I opened the door and called my dog's name. I didn't know if he'd gone through his doggy door or not, and I figured that it wouldn't hurt to peek in for just a second. That's when my neighbor appeared with his shotgun in hand. "What do you want?" he snarled. He was standing so close to me I could smell the alcohol and cigarettes on his breath. "I'm just looking for my dog," I said as I tried to stay calm. She ran over here during the storm. I thought maybe she came into your house." "Get out of my house," he said, waving the gun at me. "You're not welcome here." I took a step back as my heart raced. "Please, man, I just want my dog. I'll leave as soon as I find her." He spit at me before saying, "You're not leaving until I say so." I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. My dog came running out of the snow and I grabbed her by her collar and held her next to me. The man continued to hold me at gunpoint. He kept talking about how I was trespassing and how I had no right to be on his property. I started to feel like I was trapped, and I didn't know how to escape. I tried to make a break for it, but he immediately grabbed me by the arm and pulled me back inside. He locked the door behind us and I realized that I was now completely at his mercy. He kept that gun trained on me as he led me into his living room. I saw my dog cowering in the corner and I was filled with fear for her safety. I love that dog more than anything else in the world. Please, sir, let us go. We won't come back here again, I promise. It's an honest mistake." He just laughed. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what you're up to?" I had no idea what he was talking about, but I knew I needed to keep him calm. I started talking to him, trying to find common ground. I told him about my life out here and about how I love the peace and quiet. He didn't seem interested, but also didn't pull the trigger, so I kept talking. Maybe I was distracting him from his own insane thoughts. Somehow, hours passed and I started to feel hopeful. I was still sitting on the sofa waiting for him to say something or let us go. Maybe he would let us go after all, I thought. But then, suddenly, he changed. He became violent, screaming and waving the gun around. I was sure that he was going to kill us both. He was saying how we were one of them, and he was being watched and we were part of it. He seemed like he was going completely crazy, and what he said made absolutely no sense at all. I asked him to better explain what he was saying, but he wouldn't. He just kept up with his mantra of how the government is evil and always watching him. He was convinced that they wanted him dead and that he knew all of their secrets. I actually agreed about the government being evil part, but the rest of his radical ideas were just a little too insane for me to get behind. His ranting seemed to distract him even better than my talking, so I let him go on as long as he wanted to. It turns out, without interruption, he would just go on forever. And that's when I heard a sound outside. It was the sound of a car, and I knew someone was coming to help us. My neighbor stopped talking to listen, and I called out for help, hoping that they could hear me and I could hear them calling back. They said it was the police. The man heard it too and he started to panic. He grabbed me by my arm and my dog by the collar and he pulled us toward the back of the house. I struggled and tried to get free from his grasp, but he was too strong. He threw us into a small windowless room and locked the door behind us, and I could hear him pacing outside, muttering to himself. I was desperate to escape. I tried to break down the door, but it was too solid, and he yelled when I banged on the wood. I tried to find a way out through the walls, hoping that they were thin, but they were too thick and there were no windows. I was trapped with no way out. I don't know how long we were in that room, but it felt like an eternity. I was cold and hungry, and my dog was curled up in a ball on my lap. I started to lose hope again when I heard the sound of the lock turning. The door opened, and a police officer stepped inside with his gun drawn, and he had come to rescue us. The man was arrested on the spot, and I was finally able to go home. I was shaken and exhausted, and I was grateful to be alive. And apparently, one of our other neighbors had heard him yelling, and he knew how mentally unstable he was, so they immediately went to just calling the police, just in case he was involved with anybody else. And thank God they did. I never found out what had set my neighbor off that night. Maybe he was just a crazy person, or maybe he had some sort of vendetta against me, mixed with however much booze he had that night. I have no idea. Either way, I was glad to be out of his reach. I never went back to his house or on his property, and I never saw him again. But every time it snows, I can't help but think about that night, and I'll always be eternally grateful for the police officer who put his life on the line to save my life that snowy winter day. When this happened, I was around 25 and was obsessed with trying new things. I'd always been an avid fisherman, but this year I wanted to try something different. I wanted to venture out onto the lake and try ice fishing for the first time. I packed my gear, grabbed my fishing rod, and headed out to the lake early in the morning. I had invited a few friends, but they had backed out at the last minute, and I had no intention of changing my plans just because of them. It was a quiet and still day, and it was perfect for fishing. I chose a spot near the middle of the lake where I had heard my friends say that they had the best luck. I carefully made my way out onto the ice, making sure to keep my weight evenly distributed like the guy in the YouTube video I watched said to do so. The sun was shining and the sky was clear, but I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked out at the vastness of the lake. I was completely alone. I had parked my car on the edge of the road about a quarter mile from the edge of the lake. I knew that I had no cell phone reception, but my friends knew where I'd be, so I wasn't too nervous about it. I drilled my holes and baited my hooks, and soon I was pulling in fish, one after the other. It was awesome. I knew it would be fun, but that feeling was unlike anything I'd ever felt when fishing. I was having a great time and was completely caught up in the moment. I hadn't realized the ice beginning to crack beneath the weight of my now completely filled cooler. The ice beneath me gave way, and I yelled as I fell into the freezing water. I was thankfully able to take one gasp of air before being fully submerged, but panic set in the second that I was under, and whatever air I had in my lungs was blown out from the shock of what was happening. I was able to make my way back to the surface, but getting up onto the ice again was what proved to be an almost impossible task. I scrambled to get back on the ice, but it was too slippery and I kept falling back in. I tried to calm myself down, but the cold water was quickly zapping the energy from my body. I realized that I needed to get out of the water as quickly as possible if I wanted to survive. I remember hearing about a method of getting out of the water and back onto the ice. I would need to lay flat on my stomach and kick my legs hard to propel myself back up onto the ice. I tried this several times, but I just kept slipping back into the water. To be fair, the guy in the YouTube video made it look a lot easier than it was in the moment that I was panicking. My clothes were heavy and my boots were filled with water, making it even harder than I thought to get back up onto the ice. I was getting weaker and my teeth were starting to chatter. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore and my face was going numb. I just kept thinking about how that was not how I'd imagined that I'd die. I started to cry out for help, but my voice was lost in the emptiness of the lake. I was the only one there that day. Maybe I should have taken that as a red flag, but I was kind of stupid, and definitely very stubborn. So instead, there I was, completely alone with no one to hear me. I realized that if I was going to get out of this, I would have to do it on my own. No one was going to come help me, and if they ever did, it would be too late. I had to get out of that freezing water as quickly as possible. And with a final burst of energy, I tried one more time to get back up onto the ice. This time I managed to grab hold of the edge of the ice and slowly but surely pulled myself up. I was beyond exhausted. Most of my gear had fallen into the lake, and at that point I wasn't concerned about any of it. I just wanted to get back to my truck and warm up. I was shivering uncontrollably, and my clothes were completely soaked through. I carefully slid across the ice on my butt. I was scared of falling through again, and that seemed like the smartest idea. The only problem I had once getting to shore was the fact that I'd gotten completely turned around in the aftermath of it all and didn't remember where I'd come from. I had no idea what direction to go in to find my truck or the path I'd taken to the lake. I sat there on the edge of the lake for around 15 minutes. I knew that I needed to come up with a plan, but I was too weak and too scared to even think straight. As the sun started to set, I realized that I was running out of time. My wet clothes were weighing me down, and I needed to get into something to try and warm up as quickly as possible, or I knew that I was going to die out there. I managed to get up and start walking in what I thought was the direction of the nearest town. I figured sitting there was doing me no good, and at that point I had nothing else to lose. I walked for what felt like hours as my mind raced with thoughts of how I was going to make it through the night. I was scared, cold, and I knew that I was running out of time. I stumbled and fell along the way, but each time I managed to get back up and, through sheer force of will, keep walking. As the night grew darker, I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I was cold, hungry, and my body was starting to give out on me. But then, just when I thought about sitting down and just giving up, I saw a light in the distance. I had no idea what it was or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but it gave me hope, and I guess that's all I needed. I used every last bit of energy I had left in me and stumbled towards the light. When I finally made it to the door, I was too exhausted to knock. I just collapsed onto the porch as my body finally gave out on me. When I woke up, I was in a warm bed with a fire burning in the fireplace across the room. I was surrounded by strangers, but they took care of me. And I had learned that I had come across a remote hunting cabin where a group of hunters had been spending the weekend. They had called for help when they found me and had put me in dry clothes and tried to keep me warm until the rescuers came to get me. I was flown to the hospital in a helicopter and treated for hypothermia and several broken ribs. I guess all those falls that I'd taken weren't harmless after all. They said I was lucky they never punctured one of my lungs. I was lucky to have survived, and I was grateful for the kindness of these random strangers who saved me. From that day on, I knew that I would never take my life for granted again, and it showed me just how fragile and vulnerable I truly was, and I'm grateful for every day I get to live in this amazing world. I'm writing this because I want to warn others about what happened to my husband and I at an Airbnb last winter. We thought it would be a romantic getaway, just the two of us, in the middle of nowhere surrounded by snow and trees, but we never expected to be scared for our lives. It started on the second night of our stay. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It was a crunching sound like someone was walking the snow around the house. The day before was completely normal. I was ready for another great day, but obviously that was never meant to happen. I immediately woke up my husband and asked him to go check it out. He didn't hear anything and begged me to just let him sleep, but I insisted. He reluctantly got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and left the room. I listened as he made his way through the house. I stayed inside the bedroom, too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, my husband came back into the room with a look of terror on his face. He told me that there were multiple people outside, all wearing masks, and tried to break into the house. I was about to scream, but he covered my mouth with his hand and told me to be quiet. I felt tears well up in my eyes and couldn't help but get the feeling that we were going to die, and that night would be our last. We quickly gathered our things and tried to make a run for the car, but when we jumped in and my husband put the key in the ignition, the car wouldn't start. We were stranded, with no means of escape and nowhere to hide. The masked people were getting closer and closer, their footsteps getting louder, and it was obvious that they knew we were in the car. My husband was adamant that we had to run back in the house to hide in the bathroom. I wasn't sure about that. Somehow I felt safer in the locked car at that moment, but I trusted him, so we did what he said and ran as fast as we could back to the house. The front door was still unlocked, and from what we could tell, they hadn't made it inside yet. We decided to hide in the bathroom, hoping that they wouldn't find us or even attempt to look there. We locked the door and turned off the lights and tried to stay as quiet as possible. I was shaking with fear as tears began to fall down my face, and my husband held me close, trying to reassure me that everything would be okay. But I knew it wasn't. The people were going to find us eventually, and we listened as they got closer to the bathroom. They tried the door handle, and it didn't take long for them to realize that it was locked for a reason. They started to pound on the door as they tried to break it down. We could hear their laughter, their taunting, and we knew that we were in serious trouble. There's no way these people were just going to give up. I didn't get that impression, at least. The only way out was through the bathroom window above the shower. It was small, but large enough that my husband and I would be able to squeeze through. We were just hoping that we had enough time to both get out of there. I went first and then watched as my husband fell to the ground after he made his way out of the window. He closed it behind him to make it look like we were never in there, and we ran as fast as we could through the woods, our feet sinking into the snow. We were both only wearing slippers, and the snow and ice was so cold that it felt like it was burning my feet. We were exhausted, and our bodies were starting to get numb from the cold, but we kept running. We wanted to stop and rest, but my husband motivated me as best he could to keep going. We eventually stumbled upon a cabin, and we were relieved to find that it was abandoned. We took refuge there. There was a fireplace and wood, and my husband managed to start a fire to keep us warm. Before we knew it, we had fallen asleep and the sun was rising in the distance. The light peeking into the windows woke us up, and we decided that we would walk back towards the house to see if those people were still there. We slowly and quietly made our way back to the Airbnb, but there was no sign of the masked people. My husband popped the hood to the car and realized that the battery had been disconnected. He reconnected it, and we drove to the nearest town and reported what had happened. The police went to the house and didn't find any evidence of a break-in or any sign of the masked people. They told us that it was probably just our imagination, fueled by the alcohol that we had consumed the night before. There weren't even any footprints besides ours in the snow. We got in contact with the host of the Airbnb and asked if they had any security cameras that could back up our story, but conveniently that night they had not been working. There was no footage of anything. Part of me feels like we had been set up, like the whole thing was a trap and maybe the hosts were even in on it. The day after we left, the ad for the Airbnb was gone and there was no trace of the house or any vacation rentals. It was all just an incredibly sketchy situation. We even told our parents, and after hearing the whole story and how the police had found nothing, they sided with the officers too and told us that we probably had too much to drink and heard and saw things that really weren't there. But the last time I checked, alcohol doesn't make you hallucinate. We were devastated to not be believed when we had experienced something incredibly traumatic the night before, but my husband and I both know what we saw and what we heard. I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We never went back to that Airbnb and we never spoke of what happened there again. We both decided it was just something we wanted to forget. I'm sharing our story because I want others to be aware of the dangers of staying at a house that isn't your own, out in the middle of the woods. You never know who or what could be lurking outside your door, waiting to harm you. So if you're thinking of booking an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere, be careful. Don't let your guard down, and always trust your instincts. And if you hear a strange noise outside, stay inside and call for help if you're able to. It's better to be safe than sorry. I'm not one for going on hikes. I'd much rather spend my days inside, cozied up with a good book and a cup of coffee. But when my boyfriend, Greg, suggested that we go on a winter hike, I reluctantly agreed. He'd always been the adventurous type, while I was content to stay in my comfort zone. I just wanted to make him happy, and if this was how, I'd do my best to act excited about it. The drive up the mountain was gorgeous, and I was relieved that there were other cars parked at the trailhead. We grabbed our backpacks from the trunk and headed onto the trail. The hike was only supposed to take a few hours there and back, and it was so early by the time we started, so I wasn't too worried about it getting dark while we were out there. And the hike was beautiful. The snow was like a blanket of soft white coating everything around us. The crisp air was invigorating, and we took turns leading the way, crunching through the snow, making our way deeper into the woods. We were having an amazing time, and I was actually really glad that I'd agreed to go. I felt free and alive, despite the air getting colder and colder around us as time went on. But then, something went wrong. Possibly the only thing I hadn't even thought would be a possibility. We got separated. I had stopped to tie my shoe and drink some water and thought that Greg noticed me stop, but I guess he hadn't because when I looked up, he was gone. I couldn't see him anywhere, and I called out for Greg, but he didn't respond, and I started to panic, wondering how I could have gotten so turned around. I started following his tracks, but the snow started coming down heavier, and eventually, I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I tried retracing my steps, but it was no use. I was completely lost. The fear settled in, like a heavy weight on my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was dressed in a thin coat and jeans, and I knew I wouldn't last long in the harsh winter conditions. The weather app said that it was going to be clear and a sunny day, and since I knew nothing about hiking or going out into the wilderness, I hadn't prepared for the possibility of the weather suddenly changing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that Greg would come back for me. The same thoughts raced through my mind over and over again. But what if he was lost too? What if we were both stuck out here in the middle of nowhere? What if he still hadn't realized that I wasn't behind him anymore? I pushed through thoughts aside and decided that I had to keep moving. I hoped that if I kept going, I would come across something familiar or even catch up to Greg. I had to have hope. And walking helped me stay warmer than just standing still. I trudged through the snow, my legs growing tired with each step. My fingers and toes were beginning to feel this certain tingling and numbness, and my head was pounding from the cold. The snow was whipping me in the face, and I had started to consider just giving up. And then I heard it. The snow crunched behind me, followed by a loud snapping sound of twigs. Something was following me. I thought for a second that maybe it was Greg and that he'd found me, but unfortunately, I was very, very wrong. I turned, and there it was. A bear. It was massive, its fur a shaggy mess of brown, and it looked angry. We both just stared at each other for what felt like forever. I was trying to remember the saying I had learned in school about what you should do if you come across a specific kind of bear. But the fear was getting to me and my mind went completely blank. Its eyes were fixated on me, and I felt a jolt of fear rip through me. Fight or flight is pretty serious, and I guess my body felt flight, and that was the correct solution. I started to run, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the bear behind me, its growls echoing through the woods. I didn't dare look back, and I just kept moving, hoping to put as much distance between us as possible. But the bear was faster than I was, and I cried up for help when I heard it get closer. I knew that I was no match for some wild animal like this, but I couldn't just give up. I had to keep moving. I spotted a tree and climbed up as fast as I could. I was shaking, my fingers slipping on the rough bark. I finally made it to a branch and I pulled myself up, panting and sweating, I looked down at the bear and prayed to God that it wouldn't come up that tree after me. I knew that bears were skilled climbers. I was just hoping that this one wouldn't put in the effort to actually get me. The bear seemed to be about 10 to 15 feet below me. It paced back and forth. I knew I couldn't stay up there forever, but I didn't know what else to do. I was stuck, with what felt like no escape. Hours began to pass, it felt like, and the bear showed no sign of leaving. I was starting to lose hope. I felt like I would never get out of there alive. I was so cold and hungry and scared, and I was also worried about Greg, alone out there, not aware of bears lurking in the distance. And then I heard a shout, far away at first, and I called out, my voice hoarse from the cold. And it was him, rushing through the trees and snow to get to me. I saw the relief on his face when he noticed me in the tree. I yelled for him to stop and made him aware that there was a bear. Thankfully, it didn't seem to notice him yet. It still had its full attention on me. Greg gave me this look, like he was about to do something I wouldn't like. I was telling him not to do anything, but I knew he'd do it anyway. He always helped me out of trouble, and I guess that day was not any different. He called to the bear, waving his arms, trying to scare it away. The bear growled, but then, surprisingly, turned and just disappeared into the woods in the opposite direction of Greg. I climbed down from the tree very carefully, and Greg wrapped me in his arms. I was safe, but I was still scared. We still had to get out of the woods, and there was no telling when that bear might actually come back. We started walking and tried to find our way back to the trailhead. We were both exhausted and on edge, but we pushed forward. I was grateful for Greg's presence, but I was scared of the thought that something would happen to him and I'd be alone again. Everything seemed normal, but suddenly Greg screamed, and I turned to see him on the ground, writhing in pain. I rushed over to him. My heart was beating quickly when I looked down and saw what happened. His foot had gotten caught in a tree root that had been hidden in the snow, and his ankle was very much broken, like his foot was flopping around when I lifted his leg. I thought I was going to pass out just from the sheer brutality of it. I tried to lift him, but he was too heavy. His body had collapsed from exhaustion, so hopping on one foot wasn't an option. I grabbed the emergency blanket from his back and spread it out across the snow. I rolled him out onto it and tied two of the ends together and dragged him through the snow, my own exhaustion making it nearly impossible. I was determined, though. I had to save him just like I knew he'd do the same for me. I couldn't let him die out there in the middle of nowhere. The snow had finally calmed down and the wind was howling through the trees. I was freezing, my clothes and hair were soaked through, but I pushed on, inch by inch, step by step. I was terrified of what other bad thing could happen, but I was determined to save Greg no matter what. The rush of adrenaline that was going through my body was enough to keep me going for at least a little while longer. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it, the trailhead, and I let out a scream of joy as tears streamed down my face. We made it. We were safe. I dragged Greg to the car and I drove him to the nearest hospital as quickly as I could. He had started to go in and out of consciousness by that point. He was treated for his broken ankle and had to get the tips of a few of his fingers amputated after it was discovered that he had developed frostbite. I was treated for hypothermia and otherwise had escaped with only minor cuts and bruises. We were both okay, but we both changed that day. We were both scarred by what happened in the woods, and I still think about how we saw other cars at the trailhead but never saw a single person out in the trail. I wondered if they had gotten lost like us, or maybe they were further on the trail than us and made it back safely. I hope so, at least. I guess going out of your comfort zone isn't always a good thing, but I learned one thing really valuable that day. I learned about my own strength, and that nothing could stop me. Greg was alive because of my determination to get us out of there, and I thank God every day for giving me the courage to keep going. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. I've been snowboarding for over a decade now. and I've always pushed the limits of what's considered safe. I've ridden down the steepest slopes, braved the harshest conditions, and lived to tell the tale. But today, I was reminded that no matter how experienced you are, Mother Nature always has the upper hand. I was out on the slopes feeling confident and unstoppable. I was catching air, doing tricks, and just feeling generally alive, as I always do. I was so focused on the thrill of the ride that I didn't notice the signs of warning of a dangerous drop-off just ahead. Before I knew it, I was off the edge and falling down a cliff. At first, I legitimately thought that I was going to die. The wind was rushing past my face, the snow was whipping against my body, and the ground was rushing up to meet me. I managed to tuck and roll, but the impact was still brutal. I felt a sharp pain in my leg, and I knew instantly that it had broken, and the pain was just unimaginable. I laid there for a moment, gasping for breath, and tried to take a second to assess the damage. My leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and I could feel the bone grinding against my skin. I tried to move, but the pain was too intense. I was stuck. I yelled for help and hoped someone could hear me, but no one did. The pain was starting to get really bad, and I was begging for my body to give one of those adrenaline rushes you get in times like this, but it wasn't coming. I started to panic. I was far from the main slopes with no cell service and no one around. I was alone, injured, and at the mercy of the elements. I started to feel the cold seeping into my bones, and I knew that I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. I remembered my snowboard and figured maybe I could use it to help me get out of there and maybe get somewhere where someone would notice me. The snowboard was still attached to my feet, and I realized that I could use it to slide down the mountain slowly, but it wasn't going to be easy. It was my only chance. I slid my butt into the middle of the board and lifted my leg onto the front of the board as best as I could without doing any more damage. I started to panic again and doubt if this was something I could even manage. If I even had the strength or courage to save myself. This is never a situation I thought that I'd be in, and I may be the adventurous type, but never the type to survive something like this. I did my best to take the deepest breath I could and started to slide down the mountain, gritting my teeth against the pain and trying to stay in control. The snow was deep and soft, and I was able to make slow progress, but I also knew that if I lost control, I could easily fall off another cliff or get stuck in a snowdrift. Every now and then, my leg would fall off the board and get caught in the snow, and I'd scream in pain. I was so nervous the bone was going to rip out of the skin at any second. I didn't want to have to deal with a broken bone and an open wound on the side of a mountain. I took a second to myself to ask whatever God was out there to let me survive, to let me see my family again. After my break was over and I took a deep breath, I used my hands to push me further down the mountain. My ride was bumpy and the cold was starting to numb my fingers and toes. I was terrified and about to pass out from the pain, but I kept my focus on the goal. I had to get to safety. I had to make it home. As I slid down the mountain, I started to see signs from the slopes. I saw a ski lift in the distance, and I knew that I was getting close. I picked up speed, hoping to reach help before it was too late. I was screaming for help as loud as I could. My voice was becoming hoarse in the cold air. Sliding down the mountain on my butt on a snowboard is way harder than I ever could have imagined, especially with a completely broken leg. I slid off and was trying to position myself back onto the board when I heard a loud noise. I knew that sound. I've heard it many times before. It was the sound of an avalanche. I turned my head and saw a wall of snow rushing toward me. I was frozen in place, unable to move or escape, and I was about to be buried alive. At that moment, all I could think about was my wife and daughter. I thought of the life I was leaving behind. I thought of the things I still wanted to do. I didn't want to die there, in that lonely place with no one to mourn my loss. Who knows if they would ever find my body under all that snow? I closed my eyes and braced for the impact, but it never came. I opened my eyes and saw that I was still moving, still sliding down the mountain on my snowboard. I looked back and saw that the avalanche had missed me by mere inches, and I guess When I was trying to get on the snowboard, I had managed to, and I didn't realize that I had started moving since the mountain was shaking beneath me and pushing me forward. I was shaking, crying from the dramatic relief that I was feeling, but I didn't stop. I continued to slide down the mountain until I finally reached the bottom. There weren't many people around since it was a slow day for the resort, and I collapsed onto the ground and started to scream for help. Within minutes, a ski patrol team arrived. They quickly assessed my injury and called for a heli evac to airlift me to the hospital. As I was being loaded into the chopper, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the second chance at my life. I had to spend a week in the hospital, and since the accident, I've had plenty of time to reflect on what happened. I learned that even the most experienced snowboarders can make mistakes, and that the mountains are not to be taken lightly. I also learned that the will to survive can be a powerful force, and that sometimes all it takes is a little bit of luck to make it out alive. I'll never forget that day, and I'll never take the mountains for granted again. I'm just grateful to be alive and to have another chance to make the most of my life and spend as much time with my family as possible. To be honest, I don't snowboard much anymore, and I'm fine with that. If it means I'll never have to experience a day like that, ever again. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. My group of friends and I decided to hit up a local bar to celebrate the end of the semester. We drank way too much and ended up doing things we never would have done sober. I don't really want to get into all the details, but I'll tell you what happened after. One of our friends, Alex, got especially wild. He was always the life of the party, but that night he took it to a whole new level. As we stumbled out of the bar, Alex stripped down completely nude and ran into the snow. We were all laughing at first, thinking it was just some silly drunken stunt. But then he took off into the woods, still with no clothes on, and we started to get kind of worried. We were yelling for him to come back, but the sound of his footsteps got more and more quiet as we went further into the woods. The trees weren't dense, but we were all over the place. We tried to follow him, but he was too quick for us. We were drunk and stumbling everywhere, while he was moving with surprising speed and agility. I was confused because I thought he was drunk too. We searched the woods for hours, calling his name and trying to find any sign of him. It was freezing cold and started to snow heavily, making it difficult to see anything. We were so drunk that we couldn't even remember where we had entered the woods. We were lost and scared, and our laughter was replaced with fear and worry that we'd never escape. We walked around for hours in the darkness as we held on to each other so no one else would be left out there alone. None of us were dressed for the weather. We had only planned to go out drinking, not for an impromptu hike. One of my friends suggested that we walk in a straight line and we'd reach a road eventually. The forested area that we were in wasn't too large, only a couple of miles wide, so that's what we did. Walked in a straight line until we were finally out. None of us knew what to do about Alex. We considered calling the police, but my friends were able to talk me out of it. They were carrying some other illegal substances that I didn't want to be caught with, and they were worried that we'd all be suspected of something, and I eventually agreed to keep my mouth shut. It's something I still feel guilty about to this day. So I went home and just slept off the drunkenness. The next morning, I was called in for questioning by the police. They wouldn't tell me anything until I got to the station, but I knew it wasn't good when all the guys were there too. I sat down with them, and they all started whispering about how all of our stories should be the same and how we should say Alex left the bar early and we didn't know where he went or what happened. But I was done keeping it to myself. I told my friends my plan was to tell the truth. They weren't having it at all. Some even started to threaten me. When they got me in the interview room, they told me why I was there. They had found Alex. They said they found him lying face down in the snow and his skin was pale and blue from the cold. He was still naked and obviously frozen to death. I can only speak for myself when I say I was completely shocked and devastated to hear the news. I knew he had run into the woods naked, but I really thought that he'd find his way out eventually. I should have known that it was too cold to let him stay out there all alone. I shouldn't have given up looking for him. I should have called the police. The police investigation revealed that he had died from hypothermia. He had run too far in the woods, disoriented from the alcohol, and couldn't find his way back. The snow had covered his tracks, making it even more difficult for us to find him that night. When they asked me my version of last night's events, I told them everything. They thanked me for my cooperation and sent me on my way. His death was ruled an accident, and no blame was put on me or my friends, although I couldn't help but blame myself. I still have nightmares about that night. I see him running into the woods, laughing and carefree, and then I see him lying there in the snow, so cold and still. I can still hear the sound of our screams and the crunching of the snow underfoot as we ran to find him. The guilt of what happened that night haunts me. We were all so drunk that we didn't realize the danger that Alex was putting himself in. We should have stopped him, or at least tried to follow him more closely, but instead we were too caught up in the moment to think about the consequences. I don't know how to live with the guilt and the sadness that I feel. I try to tell myself that it wasn't our fault, that it was just a tragic accident, but deep down I know that we could have done more to help him. It's been years since that night, but I still think about Alex every day. I think about the laughter and the fun we had, and I also think about the fear and the guilt. I never thought that night of partying could end so horribly, but it did. And now I can never go back and change what happened. I still go out with my friends, but I never let myself get too drunk again. I never want to feel that level of regret again. I never want to be a part of a situation where someone I love could be in danger. That night changed my life forever. It's a reminder of the dangers of too much alcohol and the importance of being responsible for each other. I hope that our story can serve as a warning to others, and that they never have to experience the pain and loss that we did. I will carry those memories with me for the rest of my life as a constant reminder of what can happen when we let our guard down and become too reckless. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. You should come join. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, or send in an email, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't forget to drink from the pee jug.